Accidents happen, and it's not that hard to make a hole in your plasterboard walls. One of the most common causes are door handles going through the wall. I'm going to show you how to repair a small hole, then we'll see how to repair a large hole. And because you're more than likely to have a few scratches around, I'll show you how to patch them too and get your plasterboard walls looking as good as new. Now, there's a few different products that you will need when repairing a hole in a wall, or a ceiling for that matter. So we've got our pre-mixed product in a bucket, and we've also got our plaster in a bag. There are a few basic hand tools we will need, some cutting tools, some nice fine sandpaper, and I do recommend a good quality broad knife and trowel. And also I've got a nice handy patch board here, so I don't have to go out and buy a full sheet of jib wallboard. Rightio, here's how to patch a hole that's under 150 millimetres. First thing we need to do is mark and cut out the damaged area. To make a nice neat little rectangle around the damaged area, we don't want to go too big, but just enough to cover all the broken bits. Now, there's a couple of different ways we can go about cutting this hole out. One, I could use a utility knife, do the job nice and easy, or I can use my keyhole saw. Both of those tools will do the job quite nicely. But what I'm going to use is my favourite tool, the multi-tool. This allows me to control the depth of the cut so I don't hit any pipes or wires behind the plasterboard. Okay, that's looking really nice and tidy. Next thing I need to do is make a back block that goes in behind the wall, so when I put the filler on, it's got something to adhere to. So measure that length, which is 90 millimetres, so we want a back block that's at least 20 millimetres longer. And we are 60 millimetres wide, so I'll make that 55. Okay, I've got my back block. To hold that in place, what I'm going to do is just use one of these 60mm flathead nails, and I'm going to put that in the back of our block. Now, I've already got some pre-mixed filler I've pulled out of a tub. I'm just going to apply that to our ends, just enough so that sucks onto the back of our wall. Slip that in behind, take it up, drop it down, hold that nice and tight onto the back of the wall for about 30 seconds so that compound spreads out and suctions onto our existing wallboard. Just pop that nail through, remove the excess compound and leave it to dry overnight. Okay, it's been 24 hours, that's nice and dry. So let's give this a quick little sand up to make sure that our compound sticks to our wallboard. Then I'm just going to measure and cut a block to go in the hole. 90, so I'm just going to use my square. Excellent, so we'll just give that a wee try. That's lovely. So I'm just going to apply a relatively thin layer of compound to the back of that. Again, using some of my pre-mixed compound. Slip that in the hole. Apply some compound over top. So what I got here is jib paper jointing tape. Now I'm going to apply this over all our joins just to make sure I get a good seamless finish. If this wall was to ever move and we didn't use the paper jointing tape, you're going to get a crack. So I'm just going to apply that half over our hole. Yeah, rub that in. We want to make sure there's no bubbles underneath it. Same again for the other side. Now 2 pieces is going to be enough for this particular small hole. Squeeze that down, make sure there's no air bubbles underneath it. Now, all we're going to do is let that dry for 24 hours, then we can come back in with our second coat. Okay, my plaster's nice and hard, so I'm just about ready to apply my second coat of compound. What I'm going to do this time is just feather out the edges because I started off with a flat surface and I've built up over top. So if you were to shine a light on there now, you'd see quite a bit of a raise there. So what we need to do is feather it out. So taking that area at least another 100 millimetres from what it is now. And then once again, I'll leave it to dry overnight and we'll be ready for our third and final coat. Okay, it's been 24 hours. I'm just gonna take off any rough edges now before I put my finishing compound on. I'm just gonna use this ready filler. So I'm going to put that on a taping knife. And using smooth, steady strokes, I'll cover the whole area. Then one last overnight dry, and she'll be ready for a sand. Rightio, that looks absolutely fantastic. Can't see my hole whatsoever. So all I need to do now is give that a wee little tickle up using my 220 grit sandpaper on my nice little hand sander there. You can use the same method for repairing downlight holes in your ceiling. Just use a hole saw to cut a circular patch the same size as the downlight hole and follow the same steps. Now, when we're repairing a hole in a wall that's larger than 150 millimeters, the principles are pretty much exactly the same as repairing a small hole. The only difference is we're going to need to cut the damaged area back to a stud or a solid fixing that's within the wall. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can find exactly where our solid fixing is within the wall. One of the most reliable ways is using one of these fantastic stud finders. Now, that's indicating that's the side of my stud, and that's exactly the center of my stud. So if I just mark that there, I can now measure my board out from that. Obviously, I want to chop as minimal amount of that wall board out as possible. So going from my center mark, the board is blowing out quite a bit across the back of that. So I'm just going to take a little bit more around it. So if I cut out a hole that's approximately 270 millimeters square, that gives me my solid fixing and a good size to patch. So I'm going to cut my board, then bring it back over to the wall. 270. Now, good tip. When you're cutting your wallboard, make sure that your blade is super sharp. It makes a big difference. And we don't have to cut all the way through. All we're doing is scoring the top layer of the paper, and we just snap that, turn it over, score the back of it, and it just snaps off nice and tidy. So we just want to make sure we don't have any dags on the end, so we can just tidy those up. Then using my level, I'll mark a line down the center of my stud and the bottom of my hole. I can now use my little patch board, put those on those marks. And again, I'll use my multi-tool so I can control the depth of the cut. So I'm just going to finish up the little corners where our multi-tool didn't get into. Lovely. Okay, so that's looking good. So what I need to do now is cut another panel of jib board that's going to go on this side here to take our patch. Because I've already got solid fixing on this side, I need a piece for that. This back block needs to be at least 100 mil wide and 100 millimeters longer than my hole. So again, I'm just going to use my trusty T-square, cut that off. I'll apply some compound to the outer edges. Position it in place. Remove any excess compound on the back block and let it dry overnight. And like we did when patching our small hole, I'll give the area around the hole a quick sand so the compound has a rough surface to adhere to. Okay, so I've got some compound on my knife and I'm just going to apply that to the right-hand side so the two pieces of wallboard adhere to each other. Now, we don't want to put too much in, otherwise it will stick out past the line of our board. Just sit that in there, gently squeeze that in. That's great. So I've just got some of these nice little jib grabber, jib wallboard screws, and I'll use them to attach my patch to the solid fixing on the left. So when you're putting your screws in, just make sure that you don't actually puncture the face of the paper. It's also good practice to put in some screws into our existing wallboard. We don't know how that was fixed. You know, if it's an older jib wallboard, it may not be adhered to the wall very well. So just as a precaution, I'm just putting in some extra screws just to make sure it's nice and tight to our framing. Okay, so that's looking really good. Next step is apply some of our compound around our join. And then I'll apply a piece of jointing tape along each side of the patch board and embed it into the plaster using my broad knife to scrape away any bubbles, leaving a thin layer of plaster underneath. After 24 hours drying time, I'll apply a second coat over the entire area, feathering it out past the edges. What can be handy on a hole that's relatively large like this, you can use your trowel, nice and flexy trowel like that is fantastic. We can also use one of these taping knives, which gives me a lot better coverage. Obviously the bigger knife that I've got like this will give me a flatter finish. Again, I'll let this dry overnight, then I'll apply my third and final coat, making sure to feather it out smoothly. Don't worry too much about imperfections, as once this coat is dry, it's time to give the whole area a good sand up using our 220 grit sandpaper. And finally, here's how to sort out a scratch that's less than 2 millimeters deep. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just got to make sure that area is nice and clean. I'm going to give that a sand up to make sure the compound adheres well. Just using my nice clean broad knife, take a little bit of our ready filler, and I'm just going to apply that over the scratch. For scratches under 1 millimeter, we're going to let that dry for at least 24 hours. Any scratches over 1 millimeter deep, we're going to let it dry for 48 hours. Okay, so that's looking nice and dry, fantastic. So what I'm going to do is use this nice fine sanding block. This is about a 220 grit. And I'm going to sand in the direction of the scratch. What you don't want to do is in a circular motion. So that's how easy it is. The walls are repaired and ready for a paint. And if you like what you've seen, subscribe to the Mitre 10 YouTube channel for more handy content, or click here to watch some now.